Well, my name's Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. I am not the president. I did study politics, though. This particular program is near and dear to my heart. I'm really excited about it. The Computer History Museum has, in the last 6.5 years, which is as long as I've been here, has embarked upon a mission and purpose that really speaks to the use of computing and the fact that life doesn't exist without computing for anyone that we know. And when you start to think about governance and the process by which we live in nation states and election technologies, frankly speaking, that was my thesis work when I was a politics student at Princeton in the 1970s, and the 18-year-old vote kicked in. And I was studying how the 18-year-olds organized to get out and vote. And back then, because residency requirements had changed, students could vote in their college town. And they only needed to be 18 years old. And of course, it was women's rights, civil rights, and rock and roll that we used to get out to vote. It's kind of like the same thing that's going on right about now. But anyway, I'm really excited to have Ira here tonight and for him to be able to give a talk about his new book. I'm, as I said, it's just near and dear to my heart. I think it's particularly important. Computing in the beginning was all about people. People were the computers. And then as we put them to work, we've seen various fits and starts and how they've been able to affect society. And this is a groundbreaking moment in 1952 when these things started to emerge, and we'll hear more about that tonight. I did mention, the museum's mission and purpose is around decoding technology, the computing past, the digital present, and the future implications on the human condition. Because history is really not about the past, right? We're here in the present having a conversation about things in the past, and ideally we're learning things that will help us shape a better future. And so that's an important part of this institution's mission and purpose. So without further ado, let me introduce Ira Chinoy. He's an associate professor emeritus at University of Maryland and the College of Journalism, of course, and he's previously has been a journalist, as you know, for 24 years. And the book is a really exciting one, Predicting the Winner, the Untold Story of Election Night 1952 and the Dawn of Computer Forecasting. The last thing I'm going to say is my last business job, other than working here at the museum, was at Microsoft. And in 2012, I started working both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, for the 2016 election cycle. So I spent 4 years working with the campaigning infrastructure by which the US presidential election is run. And so I have a real keen understanding of what happened then. This is really the foundation piece of work right now. What we're going to hear tonight is where all of this stems from. And so Ira, let me welcome you up here, and we'll look forward to your talk.
Thanks, and thanks for coming. I did a little bit of my research here a long time ago, 18 years ago. As a matter of fact, this has been a labor of love for a long time. And actually, I'll tell you just a little story about this being a labor of love, which is, I worked on it on and off. It was a PhD dissertation because I got that at a very advanced age. And then I wanted to do it as a book, and I finally went through all the things you do to do a book. I found time to write it. I got an agent, worked with an agent to come up with a proposal. It took a bunch of months. He had me cut 30,000 words out of my draft, which was like cutting off your arm. It was like crazy, and made it a better book. But and then it was time to find a publisher, and so he deemed this proposal ready, and he sent it out to I don't know, maybe a dozen publishers that he knew, had relationships with. And so they started coming back rejections. Nice, very nice, but rejections. Like, just not, this isn't the book for us. It's a great book, but this isn't the book for us, stuff like that. And finally, after, I don't know, about 10 of these, which is a small number for people who, the stories I've heard. I was talking with a friend of mine who's been a writing coach for a long time, and, was helping him think about his book. And I said, I don't know, should I be dejected? He goes, no. He said, you only need one. And he said, I'm going to send you something I wrote about famous rejection letters. And he sent me an article he'd written about famous rejection letters. And the one that completely stood out to me was Herman Melville. 1851, writes Moby Dick, and has a publisher in the United States and is trying to get published in London. And he gets a letter back, a rejection, and it says, one of the first lines is, "First we must ask, does it have to be a whale?" So, I put that in my office so I could see it. And the very next response was, someone offering me a contract, and so we were able to do that. It's a big process. So in 2001, I want to tell you a little bit of a personal story to explain the journey to this book. In 2001, I returned to academia after 24 years in journalism. I started a little paper in Arkansas, and sort of by the end, I was on the investigative team at the Washington Post and the director of what was then called computer-assisted reporting, which is today called data journalism. And around that time, I encountered an article in Slate magazine by a media critic that was really dismissive of data journalism and journalism schools. And I'm going to read it to you, my reporter's notebook. And this is what he said. "I'd rather hire somebody who wrote a brilliant senior thesis on Chaucer than a J school, journalism school, MA who's mastered the art of computer-assisted reporting. If you can crack Chaucer, you've got a chance at decoding City Hall. If you're a computer-assisted reporting wizard, maybe you can come reformat my hard drive." And it was really, okay, that was really kind of brutal, but it wasn't, that hasn't aged well. Obviously, that has not aged well. I'd love to encounter that person and just ask him a question. And we're at my home base, Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, we of course teach the basics, writing and ethics and all that, but we also try to teach whatever is on the near horizon that students are going to encounter, and they often go out and they are the ones who know this and the old people in the newsrooms don't. And so, and we have at least 6 people now that can teach some form of data journalism, data visualization. It's kind of taken hold, but it wasn't always that way. And I started my career in the pre-internet era literally writing my stories on a typewriter at the Pine Bluff commercial in Arkansas. And so it was quite a journey for me to do there. But this dismissiveness that I encountered in that article was nothing new to me. And I had been encountering it for years. And often the people who did this data journalism, computer-assisted reporting, maybe were the only person in the newsroom who did that. And so we formed a community of people across newsrooms, right, to sort of to teach ourselves how to do this. But anyway, I had seen everything from embrace to resistance to everything in between, a lot of derision about using computers in journalism, which now strikes us as weird, but you got to go back in time and think about what that was. So I wanted to go back. I had to do a dissertation, my advanced age, and I wanted to go back and figure out when journalism and computing first hooked up. When did they first come together? And I was stunned to find that it was all the way back in 1952, and that in fact it was for election night forecasting in 1952, at a time when both computing and TV were brand new. TV news were brand new. They were not established, and no one would know that they were established. And now we have a time when journalists are wrestling with new technology, and that's not new either. Journalists have been doing that for a couple hundred years. And so I thought maybe if I looked at this, I might learn something about resistance to innovation, right? What embrace and resistance to innovation. And then election night 2020 happened. And this is not something I envisioned when I started this project. And in talking with my agent, this was before we sold the book, we both came up with this idea that I decided I needed to kill off that last chapter on innovation, and I needed to do something about how do we move forward from 2020. So the final chapter in this book is a thought experiment on how we do that, and I'm happy to talk about that later on. I'm sure you will have questions for me. So this talk is an account of several things. It's the history itself. It's what I call the story of the story, how this research was done, how this election night thing gets a little mention every 4 years in all sorts of news stories. They're almost all wrong. and it's like the cartoon version of this event, but never been explored in detail. So I want to begin by reading you two passages from the book that will help set up the sort of the content, and then the first paragraph of the acknowledgments. I'm going to read that to you also because it's a thinly veiled preface to the book, and set it up. And then I have, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, and then I created a dozen little video clips of 30 seconds to a minute to just show you what it was like on that election night. So, and again, this idea of, the story of the story, how this comes together. There are probably about 20 places in the book. It's a history book, but where I break into the first person and explain, well, how did I find this stuff? And that's the treasure hunt. That's the treasure hunt part of this. And I thought instead of relegating that to the 913 endnotes, that some of it deserved to be in the book itself. Okay, so this is the first paragraph of the book. Nobody saw it in real time. How could they? The history of American elections changed profoundly on the night of November 4, 1952. The candidates were at the center of attention, of course, but they were not central to this change. We can see its significance now with decades of hindsight. Something never tried before was launched live and untested on national television. Viewers witnessed an outside-the-box approach to predicting the winner from early returns using something new: computers. Like exhibits in a freak show, the computers were referred to as electronic brains and mechanical monsters. That's the way it can be with innovations, considered laughable before they become so locked in that we cannot imagine life before them. This innovation would help fuel an obsession with numbers as a way of understanding and shaping politics. It would also engender controversy right down to our own time. And it would herald a future in which the public square would go digital. Yet on that night, this path was in no way guaranteed or even envisioned. Americans did not yet have computers at home or at work. Most had never seen one. The thinking in broadcast news circles was that the flashing lights of these newfangled gizmos, as they spit out forecasts, might provide an edge. Television news executives hoped to get a jump on the competition, both in calling the election and in attracting viewers. But the whole enterprise of reaching outside the box with something so new was an enormous gamble. And it is important to understand, especially in our own time, that this gamble was undertaken in response to a crisis of credibility. This crisis was the fallout from election night forecasts 4 years earlier that turned out to be upside down. What's more, a lackluster presentation of returns on television in 1948 was at odds with television's promise as a new visual medium for news. What transpired 4 years later in 1952 is a complex tale of innovation in response to crisis, along with reactions that ranged from enthusiasm to ridicule to outright resistance. The events surrounding that election night in 1952 also offer us a way to think about another more recent inflection point: the vexing events of 2020 and the future of election nights in America. So that's the beginning of the book. And then this, the acknowledgments is where I sort of set up what it took to do this book that gets repeated in this cartoon version every few years. The story I've pieced together in this book and in a PhD dissertation that preceded it was not told before because the evidence I needed to tell it lay hidden and took years to assemble. Dozens of people helped me along the way to make these finds and to make sense of them: mentors, colleagues, historians, librarians, archivists, friends, and family. There were documents tucked away in archives, in personal collections, and in company records. Old television footage and radio recordings were hard to find. Relevant news articles and ads turned up in databases of historical newspapers with search terms that had to be refined by trial and error. The memories of a few living participants of these long ago events provided leads and details, not to mention delightful conversations, once I was able to identify them and track them down. Little of what I needed to tell the story was on the open web, though some important pieces were. A bare bones version of a few parts of this saga had been told and retold before, but these events had not been explored in depth to reveal the surprises, new meanings, and relevance to our own time that you will find here. This treasure hunt took me by subway, car, train, and plane to archives and museums in Wisconsin, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, California, and Washington, D.C. I traveled to Alabama and Pennsylvania for interviews with surviving innovators, to the Christie's Auction House in Manhattan, and to see records stored on microfilm at the Library of Congress, in boxes of documents at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, in collections of newsreel footage at the National Archives, in a set of old newsletters at the New York Public Library, and much more. I received records sent by archivists in Wyoming, Michigan, Texas, Georgia, Minnesota, and elsewhere. This is also the only exploration of election night, 1952, to piece together the television broadcasts from CBS and NBC, 13 hours combined. It's exhausting just reading it. Okay, so see if I can get this right. Good, okay. So the story I want to tell, as I said, been mentioned countless times before in these very simplistic versions, and can almost trace the beginning of it. This is maybe a week or two after the election, and clearly Remington Rand, which was a manufacturer by then of the UNIVAC computer, one of these computers, was engaged in a PR campaign, right, to get this out. And so the story, everybody loves the man bites dog story, right? Dog bites man, not a story. Man bites dog, that's a story. And so this idea that a machine makes a monkey out of man, that was what this was about. And the story basically was the computer got it right, the people didn't believe it, and so they didn't put it on air, ha ha ha, and the computer did turn out to be right. So obviously that's a much deeper story, but that began, and then these are just examples these are some from stories that come out every 4 years, and I've just circled the things that are wrong with them, because people tend to, if you don't know what's going on, you just fill in the blanks, right, when you're writing these stories. So this one says the UNIVAC was the only general purpose computer of its day. Not even close. This one says that J. Presper Eckert, who was one of the two inventors, explained to viewers on election night, blah, blah. He wasn't there. The network balked at UNIVAC's first oracular result. The network didn't know what the first result is, because the UNIVAC team didn't share it with the network, because they were so freaked out that it was calling for a landslide, and the prediction was for a razor's edge close election, and they thought they would be screwed, basically, if they got it wrong. And then there's time here, and the times are not correct, right? So these are all things that took a while to sort of work out, but they fit into the mythology of this thing. So, for me, it was a chance to sort of figure it out. So I am going to talk about what happened. There were competing computers on competing networks. There were competing visions of computing, and you'll see one of them is this giant UNIVAC, too big to move from the factory floor in Philadelphia, 8 tons. It was so big it had the air conditioning in the middle, and they would put their lunch there, to keep it cool. And the Monrobot, which was this tiny thing that was it was desk size, very micro for its day, and was designed to be run by sort of ordinary office workers. So really, not just two different computers, but two really different visions. I'll talk about that. There's a lot here about taking risk and containing risk. Things did not go as hoped or planned. I will talk about that. What people saw, what the UNIVAC team saw, and these people were brilliant, but what they saw was colored by what they expected to see. And this will all sound familiar to you, but the pollsters who were basically burned in election night 1948, Dewey defeats Truman, right, that whole thing, called for a very close, very, very close election, and it was a landslide, and the computer basically called that, and the computer team said, oh God, if we release this, our little infant industry will be put back decades. We can't possibly release that. So there's a long backstory to that. There's a lot of responses to this technology. It does tell us a lot about innovation and what we need to really understand about innovation, which is things don't always work right at first, but that doesn't mean you abandon them. And then I do have some thoughts in the book about why this matters going forward, and you might have some thoughts too, and that's something that we can talk about. All right, so what follows are 12 short clips, and if I don't mess it up, they'll play fine, and then I might pause in between to just give you some commentary. So we're starting with CBS, 8 p.m. election night, and which is where the UNIVAC was going to be. They were going to use the UNIVAC, right? So here we go. Fingers crossed.
Good evening, everyone. This is Walter Cronkite speaking to you from CBS Television Election Headquarters here in New York City. And now for perhaps a prediction on how this voting is going, what the vote that is in so far means. Let's turn to that miracle of the modern age, the electronic brain UNIVAC, and Charles Collingwood.
Collingwood was known to Americans on radio, and he was one of the Murrow boys covering World War II. He was very well known, he was very charming, and they hooked him up with the UNIVAC for election night to humanize it.
And now for perhaps a prediction on how this voting is going, what the vote that is in so far means. Let's turn to that miracle of the modern age, the electronic brain UNIVAC, and Charles Collingwood.
This is the face of a UNIVAC. A UNIVAC is a fabulous electronic machine which we have borrowed to help us predict this election from the basis of the early returns as they come in. UNIVAC is going to try to predict the winner for us just as early as we can possibly get the returns in. UNIVAC lives down in Philadelphia. He's one
See
of
the
a
lights
family of
blinking there?
Electronic brains made by the Eckert-Mauchly division.
This was just a mock-up.
And
They attached it as something like a Christmas tree light timer. So that's why it's blinking.
I'll tell you a little bit about the theory of this. This is not a joke or a trick. It's an experiment. We think it's going to work. You know, the theory is pretty simple. It is that if you knew all about previous elections, if you knew how the votes came in and so forth, then as the votes come in this election, you ought to be able to compare them with what happened in the past and judge what the result will be tonight. And in Philadelphia, the UNIVAC there has a similar face, as you can see. That's the way he communicates to us, through that typewriter there.
So that's the output.
And it's on that typewriter, which moves without any human agency.
Any human agency. It's like a barker in a circus show, right?
Will give us his predictions. Can you say something, UNIVAC? Have you got anything to say to the television audience? You're a very impolite machine, I must say. But he's an awfully rapid calculator. There he goes. What's he saying? I think he's saying hi, anyway. In there is where UNIVAC remembers hour by hour all the returns of the 48 and 44 elections. It's quite a machine. And as a matter of fact, you know, I got so interested in telling you about UNIVAC, I forgot to ask him what his prediction is. UNIVAC, can you tell us what your prediction is now on the basis of the returns that we've had so far? Have you got a prediction for us, UNIVAC? I don't know. I think that UNIVAC is probably an honest machine, a good deal more honest than a lot of commentators who are working, and he doesn't think he's got enough to tell us anything about it.
So he's looking up actually at a sort of something like this, up above the computer, where what's supposed to be transmitted is returns, and it's not happening, right? And there's a long story to that. Okay, so let's go to the next one.
As a great believer in the machine, we're having a little bit of trouble with UNIVAC. It seems that he's rebelling against the human element.
Yes, UNIVAC's finally come through.
Good. Give it to us, huh?
We've got Stevenson, 20 states. Eisenhower, 28 states. That adds up to an electoral vote for Stevenson of 217, for Eisenhower, 314.
And you can't see it there, but my recollection is that there's an ashtray embedded in the console because it is the 1950s. Okay. So Eric Sevareid will be known to people of a certain age. I can see there are a few of you here. And was also well known for his coverage of World War II, and he was the éminence grise of CBS radio and television. And he had a chance once an hour to weigh in with his analysis, you know, like what's going on here. And at this point, he decided what he was going to do was talk about the UNIVAC, because there had been some bumps in the road, and there had been some wacky predictions and other things along the way. So he was gleeful about that. And you can see here, there's this issue of these computers invading our human turf as journalists.
Well, since our time is short, Walter, I will only say that I'm delighted that UNIVAC, our machine competitor, was wrong for a while, and we were consistently right with a human voice, or we'd all be victims of technological unemployment pretty soon.
Okay, so this poor guy, Arthur Draper, he was sort of overseeing, he wasn't himself a computer scientist, he was an engineer, but he was overseeing this operation, and he had to come in and explain why they were late with a forecast, which I will talk about, and why they came out with some really kind of wacky predictions along the way. The earliest prediction that came out was 101 odds of an Eisenhower landslide, and it was only off by a few votes of what it finally was. The timing of that is a little unclear, and the UNIVAC team finally did put that prediction up late in the night after some others that showed it being very close. The timing of that, it wasn't at the time that it was said, but it was, it was early enough that it would have been important if they'd released it at that time, but they were afraid.
Art, what happened there when we came out with that funny prediction?
Well, we had a lot of troubles tonight. Strangely enough, they were all human and not the machine. When UNIVAC made its first prediction with only 3 million votes in, it gave 5 states for Stevenson, 43 for Eisenhower, 93 electoral votes for Stevenson, 438 for Eisenhower. We just plain didn't believe it. As more votes came in, the odds came back, and it was obviously evident that we should have had nerve enough to believe the machine in the first place.
Okay, so, I was a reporter for a long time, 23 years, local, up to national, and I lived in the era in which if there was a screw up, the public officials would say, oh, it was a computer error. It must have been a computer error, And these guys, there no way they was going to say it was a computer error because this was their new industry. This was their baby. They were not going to blame it on the machine, and it wasn't the machine's fault. Okay, so then we switch over to NBC, and NBC used this little computer desk size, which they did have trucked in to Rockefeller Center, the Studio 8H, which is where Saturday Night Live is filmed now. Arturo Toscanini had his NBC orchestra in that space before that. And you'll see at the beginning of this, it's being announced, and you'll see crowds milling about, right? And so it was customary in newspapers to invite in, friends of the newsrooms, friends of the publisher, whatever, to see what was going on. And so that's what they did for TV, and they had them roped off. They had these employers called guidettes who sort of made sure they stayed in place and gave them information. It was all very elaborately choreographed. We kind of see that here. Here we go.
6 minutes after 9, New York time. Kenneth Banghart reporting from NBC's television election headquarters. Famed Studio 8H, largest in the world, packed with men and machines, set to bring you the most complete election coverage ever devised. NBC has brought to this great election headquarters its hardest-headed political observers, and others wait near NBC cameras across the land to report and interpret the rush of the returns beginning to flood from the polling places.
That table.
Our experts will be aided for the first time by amazing new machines, scientific brains rallied by NBC television.
So it was a very multimedia thing. The radio reporters were there, and the TV people were there. Okay. All right, so it's time to have the first Monrobot, segment of the evening, and that didn't happen until about 10 p.m. No matter how the mythology evolved around this, they were not going to put these computers on with their predictions until it was pretty clear, how the race was going. And there were many, many ways of knowing on election night. But anyway, so you'll see that Bill Henry, who was the anchor, who was normally was a columnist for the LA Times, a sports columnist. He'd anchored the convention for NBC. He had covered the Olympics. He was sort of the multimedia, all-around reporter of his day. And you'll see that he had written a column a couple days before the election, kind of poking fun at the idea that a computer was going to be used at NBC. It's like he didn't get the memo or something, And so you'll see this look of mirth on his face when he introduces it.
Well, one of the more interesting features of our election coverage here is the mechanical brain, the Monrobot, which is being watched now by our man Beatty, who is riding herd on it, and Morgan is ready to explain it. So now to Morgan Beatty.
And the Monrobot, the electronic brain, is raced far ahead of the election returns at this moment, and they have tabulated 5 million votes and combined them with millions of digits that have run through these electronic tubes here, and they've calculated the odds at this point of the election returns, and they show General Eisenhower is favored to win 6-5 on an isolated moment ago. You may have heard it from Springfield, where one of the administrative assistants to Adlai Stevenson came out and told reporters that the news is not good at this time and it looks pretty grim. That was confirmed a half hour ago by the electronic brain.
So you saw that there were tubes, right, in the back and blinking lights. The Monrobot was built in such a way that those were fastened to the back of what was the surface, the cover of the computer, and it was meant to be closed. But on election night, they needed something that looked, they needed blinking lights, right? That's what they needed. And so they popped it up, and in the course of doing that, little bits of solder fell onto what was the magnetic drum computer, and I found someone who was then very young, had just graduated from the University of Maryland with an engineering degree, and his job was to lean over this thing with tweezers and pick out every one of these pieces of solder before it completely destroyed the drum. And he said it's like not really clear how completely functioning the thing was on election night. And you also saw a young woman at the entering commands, right? And there's a whole other story about her, which I'll tell you, but her name was Marilyn Mason. And she was something of a pioneer whom you have never heard until you read this book. And I'll talk more about her as we go along.
And now let's go across the hall to the brain and to Morgan Beatty.
And over here at Monrobot, the electronic brain, we've been ahead of these trends all evening. We've picked up some more interesting things here. We run the popular vote in through these electronic tubes in comparison with mathematical formulas based on the last election and the expected vote, and the result is that trends are established.
So that was an attempt at transparency. I'm not sure anybody actually understood it, but they're kind of trying to figure it out as they go. Okay, so this is important.
Change. The odds are now 10-1 in favor of Eisenhower. He just won't make it 100.
Well, thank you, Morgan Beatty. One of the things that I don't think that brain can tell us is what accounts for some of these things that have happened.
So again, trying to preserve the human part of this, that brain can't take away our job as analysts, and it couldn't at that time. But it's it's a panic about this new machine and what's it going to do to us. Okay, and then this is the end of the evening.
One of the interesting features of what we've been doing tonight has been the work of Morgan Beatty with the Monrobot, the wonderful electronic thinker, and we want to prove to you that it is possible for Mr. Beatty to speak, think, and act without having an electronic tube in one ear. And Morgan, tell us what you think of this election.
Well, I think our Mike Monrobot, our new star, performed beautifully.
Okay, and then one other thing, which is weather report is always a big part of election night. This was the weather report on NBC, which they usually do beforehand because it determines who's going to come out.
And while we can't tell you right now very much about the results, but we'll bring you some very shortly, we can tell you one or two very definite things. First of all, about the weather. Let's take a look for a moment at the weather map of the United States. There you are, it is the United States, and now on the northeast, on the east coast, sunshine, almost across the United States. There was just in the southeast, the least little bit of rain down in the general neighborhood of northern Florida. And then proceeding across the country, there was not rain, but sunshine over a great part of it, until we got out into the Arizona and New Mexico area. There was a little rain, and also in the Pacific Northwest, up in Oregon and in Washington, a little rain. But generally speaking, the weather was very fair, was very good, And the natural result was that we have had probably the greatest outpouring of voters in the history of this country. Nothing of the kind has ever been seen.
So it looks funny to us now, but they were making it up. You know, there was no computer graphics. There was this. You could see this was a transparency. You can see at one point a hand and something else, right? They're just kind of making it up, you know. And so I give them a lot of credit for that. You know, I have a friend. When I came to Maryland, one of the first people I met was a historian named Robert Friedel, and who's since retired, a preeminent historian of technology. And he said, you know, that the blessing and the curse of the historian is to know how things turned out, right? And sort of, you know, we have to transport ourselves back in time and forget that we know what happened. And so I want you to forget for a minute that you know there was a Monrobot computer in this thing, because the only story was the UNIVAC story. All right. So I came across this, and I'm going to zip now through a lot of these because these are just the story, how the story came about, my story came about. So this was a UNIVAC, Unisys history newsletter. There are a lot of people who are enthusiasts about different pieces of history, and I found this one. And this one mentioned, you know, the UNIVAC and the Monrobot. And I went, what? What is this Monrobot? Again, you have the advantage now of knowing what I know now, but this was nowhere to be found. The Monrobot, what is that? And so I reached out to Paul Ceruzzi, who probably is known to people here. He's a, you know, really kind of a leading historian of computing, and I had met him at Maryland. And I reached out to him and I said, can I come talk to you? You know, plus he hangs out at the Air and Space Museum, so that was kind of neat. And I want to come and I talk to you like a bit. Is this thing really a computer? Because the lingo was very mixed up. There are computers that were called calculators. There were calculators that were called computers. And so he found this. So there was a newsletter called the Digital Computer Newsletter. It was published as a little insert in this journal called, and I kid you not, Mathematical Tables and Other Aids to Computation. You know, a bestseller, I'm sure, in certain communities. And he reached up on his shelf and he had all these files and he pulled down the, you know, the M's for Monroe and he found it. He said, yeah, this was a computer and it has debut on election night. And here's a bunch of stuff about it that was in this newsletter. And along the way, I figured out that the computer was made by a company called the Monroe Calculating Machine Company. Again, people of a certain age will have had Monroes. They're still actually making calculators. This was like the beginning of the dot-com era. Everyone was jumping in, right? And so, I put on my reporting hat and I tracked down what happened to this company. They were bought and sold, bought and sold, bought and sold. Eventually ended up in a industrial park in Pennsylvania, and I called up, got a hold of the CEO, who was wonderful, and I said, you know, do you know anything about this thing in the 50s? He said, no, I got here in the 70s. I've never heard about that, but I knew they were interested in history. But my next question to him was, do you have any records from the 1950s? And these are his words exactly. I've been waiting years for someone to ask me that question. And this is the stuff that makes your heart stop, right? If you're a reporter, if you're a historian. And he said, yeah, whatever I have is here. There are a bunch of filing cabinets off the factory floor. You're welcome to come up. I came up and spent probably a total of 3 days off and on. I ended up closing the place down a couple of times. They just left me with the copy machine in the office. But we opened the drawers and we came to this drawer, and it had a run of this magazine called Keynote, which the Monroe company had put out a magazine, you know, about their exploits. And we found November 1952, and you know, I'm like, you know, I can't believe this is going to be here. And I open it up, and there was this double truck, newspaper speak, display, Monroe flashes election trends. And it had all this information that I did not have, that was not anywhere in circulation. And it had, you know, the inventor, it had this young woman, Marilyn Mason, it had all the people involved. And in agate, over on the right-hand side, agate type, small type, were the names of everybody from the company who'd been involved. This is unbelievable. And so it took me a while to track down. I was hoping that Bill Burkhart, the inventor, was alive. He had just died, but his wife was living not very far from here. She was in her 80s. And when I figured out that she had been the art critic for the San Jose Mercury News, my dean had been the #2 editor at the San Jose Mercury News. And I said, do you know Dorothy Burkhart? And he goes, oh, lovely, lovely person, good journalist. There I said, do you know that her husband invented that computer I've been yammering about for years? He said, no. And so when I called her up, the first thing she said, well, any friend of Tom's is a friend of mine. And I came out and I spent a few days here and looked through the stuff that she had. Okay, so then we get to UNIVAC side, and I'm just skimming the surface here. I found about this archive of records in Delaware, the Hagley Museum. And one of the things I circled here is reports and legal records. They had a lot of records from a very famous lawsuit containing a lot of reports. And so this was one of them. And it was basically how UNIVAC predicted the election, right? And detail with mathematical formulas and everything about how they did this. This was another gold mine. It had names of people. And I found one of those people, two of those people were still alive. And Max Woodbury was in Alabama, and he was sort of the mathematician. And Stephen Wright was in Pennsylvania, and he was in charge of the programmers. It was great. Then I wondered, so the Wisconsin Historical Society had a lot of records of journalists, and they had Charles Collingwood's, some of Charles Collingwood's records, and he had a election night scrapbook from 1952, unbelievable. And he had this script that he had read over the radio beforehand saying, we've had a big secret at the CBS newsroom, Project X. But now it can be told on election night we're going to try something new. The Remington Rand people are going to let us use UNIVAC, a prodigious monster of electronic thought. And so that was like a whole other track here. And then there are other things. There was stuff at the Library of Congress had these books of sort of like not transcripts exactly, but who appeared on various shows. So here's what happened on the Today Show on the day of the election. NBC also had, this was also in the Library of Congress, and I eventually got this from NBC, these program analysis cards that had second by second everything that happened in that NBC broadcast. And I got these before I actually got the footage, and that is like a whole other tortured story that I'm not even going to talk about because it would take too long. I'm happy to answer questions about it. And then I wondered, well, did these computer people ever envision at the beginning that election nights would be a thing, that's something that it might do, even journalism, right? And so, John Walkley, Presper Eckert, the two inventors in 1946 put out this prospectus basically for this new computer company they wanted to form, the first ever company just devoted to computers. And they had a background with ENIAC and other computers along the way. And I had been in touch with a dealer in old documents who lived somewhere north of the Bay here. And I'd been in touch with him, and I said, do you have like anything? He said, oh, I just shipped it all to New York to be auctioned off at Christie's. I went, oh, he said, but why don't you reach out to them and see? And I called them, and they said, yeah, it's a public auction. You are entitled to come in and inspect anything that's here. Okay, news to me. And so I talked to my wife about it, and I said, so on a Sunday morning, I took the train up to New York, went to Christie's. They had this document, which was, and a lot of other things, this document, which was the business plan for, this was sort of like a patent. What you do with a patent is you envision all possible uses. And this just was a way of getting investors, interested. And it had all these possible uses for computers. They gave me a microscope. I had to wear gloves and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting is it envisioned a lot of things, even musical instruments, because these tubes made sounds, right? But nothing even approaching election night forecasting. But I found Mauchly's papers at the University of Pennsylvania, and and again, in his papers were these documents I'd never seen referenced before, Company Confidential, where he talked about we need publicity for these computers and not treating them as something that's magic, but showing people that these are things that can solve problems in ordinary people's lives. And he was interested in weather research. That's why he invented computers, because he was a physicist. Wanted computers can do that. And he said the thing people really care about is cancer research. Okay, so then we have, I talked before, and again, this is just a taste of what was involved, but that TV was responding to this crisis of credibility for this new medium, news. And in '48, famously, newspapers and radio, they reported sort of with their minds colored by what the pollsters had said. And the pollsters were predicting that Dewey was going to beat Truman. And so that's what they saw, right? They were roundly criticized. There were studies. There were, all kinds of things. So in 1952, there were various reasons why the TV people would want to hook up with the computing people. But here is Business Week observing that for electronic computers, it's going to be a test of whether or not they have any real place in the election night hurly-burly at radio and TV studios. Now, that didn't age well either, but we got to understand that this is really new, right? And this was the response by Jack Gould. And so TV critics were also a brand new job. We didn't have TV critics until we had TV and TV news. Jack Gould was like the dean of these people. And he basically said, both these gadgets were more of a nuisance than a help. And he talked about the UNIVAC, and that the UNIVAC had this mishap, and the CBS stars gave it a rough ride. And over at NBC was still taking its electronic brain Mun robot pretty seriously, right? Okay, then there's a lot of I'm a big believer in serendipity, right? It's just, you kind of make it happen. And at my daughter's high school, they have this annual book fair, right? And people donate books, and and I donate books, and then I bring home more books, and I donate. You know how that goes, right? And I saw this book called The History of the American Presidency. When I looked at it, I noticed this little, there was sort of a little, it was like a placard advertising a burlesque show. There it is, right? Parisian flirts. But at the bottom, election returns by special wire. And I thought, that's really interesting, isn't it? That they got these girls, but they're afraid that people won't come because they're going to want to get the election news. So we're going to bring them by special wire to this burlesque show. So that got me launched on, well, what did happen before 1952? And it turned out that there were so many things that happened before then in terms of how people knew what they knew, how the word was spread, how everything was aggregated. And so I came across this in the 1890 New York Herald. It's not a presidential election, but you see that, in the days before what we think of as computers were people. And they brought in these entire tables full of people to add up numbers from the system they had of colored. And they would send people out to the precincts, they'd come back, they'd send this to different tables where different elections were being, tabulated. And so it was very, very organized. And they celebrated this story of their own, what they were doing in a full page of text and other stuff. The other thing is that over time, newspapers figured out how to get the word out at a distance. So broadcasting before broadcasting was, here's a case where the Times Tower had this powerful searchlight, and they would publish ahead of time, if it shines this way, this one's winning. If it shines that way, the other one's winning. So hold on to this and you can figure out what's going on. Broadcasting before broadcasting. And then we get sort of the dawn of radio as a news medium. We have this in 1916, and Lee DeForest is an inventor of this important piece of equipment, and he broadcasts over wireless, as it was called, to the few people who had built their own wireless sets. And he got it wrong, and actually the newspapers all got it wrong too. But it was this thing where he talked about this is a significant epoch in the distribution of news, and people probably thought he was crazy, right? But he had it. And then, you've seen in old movies, and the Times Tower has this ring of, a sign, right? That, like electronic bulletin board, lights that go around it in old movies. They have something now, but it's not the same. It was called a motograph, and they chose election night to roll out that new news service, right? So election nights are really important in the history of sort of technology. I'm going to kind of skip this one just to say that there are different versions of this document which purports to be the first output from the computer. Some say 8:30, others say 9:15, and this is a case of I found none of these that had a computer's timestamp on them. It took a long time to figure out exactly what happened behind the scenes. So why didn't the UNIVAC camp release the early prediction, which turned out to be the one that was right? And they had done They had all kinds of redundancy built into what they were doing. You know, they had a second computer lined up, they had this, they had that, but one of the things they never envisioned was, what if the computer gets it right and it's so far at odds from expectation that we don't believe it? And that's exactly what happened. And you know, the pollsters, right? So I love this. We have access to old in databases, lots of little newspapers all around the country. And so there was this one Gallup poll that AP reported right before the election, and they submit the poll, but the copy editors at each paper are the ones that write the headlines. So this is all the same story, exactly the same story with these headlines. In Bismarck, Gallup says Ike has the edge. In Brainerd, Minnesota, Stevenson may hold the lead, Gallup. And in Fayetteville, Arkansas, Gallup poll notes possibility of 50-50 popular vote, right? And UP called photo finish. The pollsters were deathly afraid of getting it wrong. So what did they do? They called a toss-up, and that's what the computer team, the UNIVAC team, had seen, and that's why they didn't believe the prediction that was pumped out. And then we had election night 2020, right? So, you know, we sort of all know what happened, that where people kind of refused to believe the outcome. You know, they refused to believe. They saw this thing well known as a red mirage, which is at the beginning, you know, the vote tends to skew Republican, and later it changes as more votes come in, and voters were told about this, and they just didn't believe it. Some of them didn't believe it, right? So the question is, what can journalists do? What can computer scientists do? And what can statisticians do? And the final chapter of the book, basically, here's a spoiler alert. The answer is not better math. It's not better math. The answer is we need to take a cue from 52 and think about what would an outside the box solution look like. And when I look at it, what I see is a couple generations of declining trust in news for various reasons, and the rise of something called news deserts, which is places where there's no local news. Think in your head of a number of how many million Americans live in a news desert, and then I'll tell you that number is 70 million Americans live in news deserts, places where there's no local news, and plenty of others where there's very little local news. And so I think until we get our handle on that, election night's going to be a problem, especially when there are these people called conflict entrepreneurs and chaos agents that are just ready, willing, and able to milk this. So I want to tell you one last irresistible story, and then I can answer questions about you know, anything that I passed over here quickly. So we may tend to think that with the passage of time, more and more is lost, right? That tends to be true, but sometimes things pop up. And so, and this is one of the reasons to get your research out in the world, even if it's a work in progress. And in my case, it was a dissertation, and to see what comes back. So this I mentioned was Marilyn Mason, and here, you know, Newsweek is having a little fun with her. NBC touted her as a beauteous PhD mathematician, and you can see that she's beautiful, and she was very smart, but she wasn't a PhD. And you know, okay. But the important thing here is that she worked for a Prudential Insurance Company, and I sort of figured out that much. But her trail grew cold for me around 1954. And at some point when you're, like when I was doing my dissertation, you just have to push the button at some point or the university comes after you, right? And so, but I had a sign above my desk that said, "Find Marilyn Mason," you know, find Marilyn Mason. Well, a few years go by and I get an email from a woman who says, "I saw your dissertation on the web. My mother was Marilyn Mason, and she died on Sunday." So, and it was what I had thought. I had thought that she got married, she changed her name. I knew she wasn't dead because she wasn't in something called the Social Security Master Death Index. But anyway, another long story to that, but eventually they came a little later to Washington to visit a friend. I said, "Come to my house and I will create a little compendium for you of all the times that your mother was on that broadcast." And they brought with them, they had her ID badge from Rockefeller Center, they had her pay stub, they had a nice letter from Bill Burkhart, the inventor, thanking her and saying how much attention they'd gotten. And then there was this curious photograph, and it's a bunch of men in suits looking sort of toward the back of a room, and she is this tiny little figure in the front of the room, and there are two displays of like maybe a drum computer, like maybe an IBM drum computer or something. And there's a thank you letter from IBM thanking her for coming and leading this tutorial on how to use this computer. And you know, there she was. And so, but she had to drop out. That was the, you know, that's what was happening in the day. And it was so amazing that the family had those records. So, yeah. So serendipity, right? Oh, I'm leaving out the best part of the story. When I was trying to find her, one of the things that the daughter mentioned to me is, you know, I see that you went to Harvard and graduated in 1977. And she said, my brother graduated in 1977. I went to the attic and found my yearbook, and sure enough, I knew who he was. He had lived in my house, so house being the residential community that I was at Harvard. It was called Dunster House. I thought, oh my God. And so in the day, you went to a main commencement in Harvard Yard, just a big ceremony, right? And then everybody repaired to whatever house they were affiliated with to get their diploma. And it meant that on the day I got my diploma in 1977, Marilyn Mason was right there. And it just, small world story. Okay, so that's what I have. And now we have this, oh, and it's logged off. I have to log it back on. This system for you to ask questions, and I will try to do my best. Are there any major problems with how modern computer election forecasting is done? Well, I don't think we have enough time to really answer that question, do we? So these are really smart people, and they have, you know, there was a period of time in which the election night forecasting was done by comparing the vote was coming in, right, which is a non-random sample, but comparing it to wherever that vote was coming from, comparing it to what that vote had been in that place before. And that was an approach that went back to the 1800s, actually. People had mastered that. And then later we got exit polling starting in the late 60s and into the 70s. And they would interview people, right? Got expensive, and you know, news organizations would collaborate. But what has happened over time is that more and more people are voting, like where I'm in Maryland, we just vote by mail, right? So you don't have a whole lot of people in some places that are going to the polls. And I think people are sometimes resistant to talk. So it's still, in some way, you know, the core of it is understanding how places had voted before and trying to make sense of that. I love watching Steve Kornacki, you know, on NBC, and John King does this on CNN. And I don't, there's some of the math is really good, like Chris Stirewalt at Fox. Fox was actually ahead of everyone in terms of calling Arizona, in part because they had an arrangement with this, you know, Associated Press and a center at the University of Chicago called NORC, and they interviewed tons of people ahead of the election, and so they were able to call Arizona before anyone else, and it got him fired from Fox, right? He really upset the powers that be, and he got fired because he was kind of a truth teller there. But, you know, it's just, people have to kind of put this together in whatever way they can put it together, and there's always learning. There are always problems, and then solutions and new. Oh, here's one. Hi, Dad. What were some challenges you faced in getting the book published? Okay, I'm happy to. That's Molly, my daughter, who's watching this 3,000 miles away. Hi, Molly. So there were, one of them was just time, because I had a life. You know, I was, at some point I became, there was, you know, I was asked to be associate dean at some point after I finished my PhD for a few years, just when the college was going through some troubles, and then I created a center with a colleague, and so I had a lot of things kind of going on. I had like a day job, and I taught. So that was just finding the time to do this, and I finally, eventually, took a full year sabbatical at half pay to actually finish and write the book, and then, you know, got a wonderful agent, Peter Bernstein, in New York. And but there's so much that goes into, so much I never had any idea of what goes into getting a book finally on the shelf. Can you talk more about the final chapter that I cut? Oh, interesting. Yeah, so I think the main thing, I would just say that the main takeaway is that we think that the main takeaway is when you look at innovation, there's always embrace, there's always resistance, there's always a whole lot in between. And I think in real time, it's important not to dismiss something because it doesn't work well the first time out. That's kind of thing one. And I think that, the other thing that I was thinking about, because I lived through this. I mean, I was a reporter in the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. And most people think that computing became more widespread in things like journalism because they got cheaper or there were more of them. And I think what's really missed in that is that in the early days of efforts like this, that you needed permission from the top to do this. Somebody at the top had to say, top of NBC or CBS had to say, yeah, we're going to collaborate with these computer people. We're going to do this, right? It was top down. But I lived through the era in which reporters were able to get their own PCs and their own software and experiment by themselves. And I think that's often missed in this idea of how new things kind of spread around. Tell us about the process of getting the NBC video footage. Okay, I'm going to try to do that. What time is it? Yeah, so I wanted initially to get the CBS and NBC footage. So I'll just talk here about the NBC. And initially, I think someone at NBC, and again, I worked on this for the better part of 2 decades, right? Off and on, off and on. And early on, someone said, oh, I don't even know if we have it. We had it, you couldn't possibly afford it. Documentary filmmakers pay $5,000 for a minute of film. There's no way you could do this. But later, I found out that they did have all of these segments. And some of them had been digitized, not on the web, and some of them were still in what was called kinescope, right? They were still on 16 millimeter film. There was no videotape in this time, so you would aim a camera at the TV and that's how you would record what's going on. And I did talk to the person who was head of the archives then, and I explained, look, NBC was at the dawn of the computer age here, and you guys have never celebrated this. I'd love to get this. And all that cost me was they had to send it out to a house, to a production facility to get it digitized, so it cost me a few $100 to do that, but they made it all available to me. But that took kind of a long time. And on the CBS side, eventually a lot of this, there were bits and pieces here and there, and I kind of gave up on it. And then I saw something else. I think it was at the tail end, might have been at the tail end of something I got from here that was about something else, a video, and then there was just a little bit snippet of that I had never seen before on Election Night 52. And I was talking about this with my friend Dan Russell back there yesterday, who said, sometimes they would reuse tape or they would reuse things, and it might have been they recorded over something else. But it gave me a lot of hope that stuff was actually there. And so I redoubled my efforts. The Peabody Awards collection in Georgia had some stuff, stuff here and there. And finally, a place called the Paley Center in New York had they had a ton of things listed in our database as election night. And none of them said 52. I found a bunch of episodes that didn't have a date listed and were in black and white. And I asked if they would screen them. And it turned out that I think 7 of those were election night 1952. And they made those available to me. But I was missing, I think, the first hour. And I was getting ready to push the button on my dissertation. It was keeping me up at night. I'm missing that first hour. I had some little snippets. I had some little bit of transcripts. And then, you wake up in the middle of the night, right? So I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, I got to go back and look at the ID numbers of the other episodes. And if you looked at episodes 2, 3, and 4, they sort of, and you counted backwards, they went down by 1 ID number. And so I went in and asked if there was something with this particular ID number, and there was something, and they scanned it for me. They viewed it for me, and it was that missing first hour. So, this was it was kind of a process to get that done. Okay, what can modern election forecasters learn from the 1952 forecasts? I think what's important about 52 was, we don't move forward without taking risks. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room who were part of, endeavors where there was risk-taking controlled in some way. And so they took a gamble, and they contained the risks as best they could. But I think they were willing to do this kind of outside the box. They went outside the box. They collaborated, the journalists, with computer people. That was a crazy idea Crazy idea in 1952. And you saw how some people responded to that, but they were willing to try it, right? And so I think now we need to think about, well, what would outside the box look like? And it could be collaboration of journalists together to solve this problem of news deserts. You know, there are a lot of things that can be done. There's a lot of collective intelligence in these communities. They may not have journalists, but they got people like you who've done all sorts of things in their lives. And how do we harvest that and the expertise that's in the room? And then you know, one of the things that really just intrigues me is how there are people who refuse to accept fact. And fact is debatable in some ways, but there's some facts that are just not debatable. And why is that? You know, why are people willing to go to these crazy conspiracy theories that are just totally fly in the face of fact? And I think one of the answers is, and I didn't invent this myself, is that people get a dopamine hit when they look at something, right? Dopamine, this transmitter that regulates, you know, pleasure in your brain. They get a dopamine hit when they look at something that is consistent with what they believe and fires them up, and they're angry. And there's other research that says basically our brain on grievance looks like our brain on drugs. And so I think we're not going to get to the bottom of that until we really kind of understand that. And it's not to sort of diss anybody in particular. You know, everybody gets these dopamine hits from something or other, but some are like really, you know, pretty far out there, you know, flat Earth or, you know, whatever that is. So I think, yeah. So that's my answer to that. You know, and there's more in that last chapter. Are humans capable of understanding how predictions work? Seems like 2020 demonstrated the limits for some people. So one of the things that's really important in journalism now, you know, we always want to be objective, but objectivity means different things to different people. And so what we want to be especially is transparent. And you saw Charles Collingwood say, this is not a joke, this is not a trick. It's like stuff that people have been doing forever, you know. So he tried his best to explain what was going on. Morgan Beatty did that thing about we run numbers through these tubes, you know, so it was like the best he could do. But transparency is kind of key. I think there is a bit of a challenge in, you know, how do you make this as transparent as possible? Why are people continuously scared of new tech? Because they are. You know, I study the history of the intersection of journalism and technology over time. I've taught it in class to students. Every student takes the first decade of some emerging technology starting in the 1820s and going forward, and I'm going to miss that class. But when we look at that, we find embrace and we find resistance, and what it takes for something to go that's always going to be the case. What it takes for something to go forward is a critical mass, more of a critical mass to push it forward than to hold it back. And I bet those stories, there are probably a gazillion of those stories here in this building. Okay. Forget computer predictions. Who do you think will win? Oh, come on. Seriously. But okay. I have no idea. But I do, if you ask me what's going to happen, I predict we're going to have something that looked like 2020, which is, you know, on the losing side, there are people who are going to say, let's say that Trump loses, right? They're already setting the stage by saying it's going to be rigged, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. They're already conditioning people to think that it's going to be rigged. And that's a lot of propaganda value there. You know, it's a lot of what happens. And so I think people are beginning to be conditioned. They did the exact same thing in 2020. They started way ahead of the election. It's why people were sort of willing to go along with that. Should we bring back the word? It was hurly-burly. Yeah, I like that word. Oh, that's a great word. No one asked me about AI. So I'm going to give you an AI question that I thought I might be asked because I prepared for it. So where's my phone? Here's my phone. Yeah, so I thought someone was going to ask me, well, how will AI figure into election nights in the future? And let me get up my device here. Yes, that's exactly what I did. I went to ChatGPT and I said, can AI be used for election night forecasting? Why not, right? And I got a pretty good answer. Yes, it can, because I don't know if anyone's used ChatGPT. It's very, very convinced of whatever its answer is. And we did this in class. I'm going to have to stop in a second here. We did this in class, and I asked them to ask questions about stuff that they knew, and something would come back and be like crazy, and the student would say, well, that's not right. And then ChatGPT would come back and say, oh, JK, actually, yeah, you're right, I was wrong, here's the other thing. So if you go and you ask this question, can AI be used for election night forecasting, I thought it was really good. Real-time data analysis, modeling, sentiment analysis, there's a lot of stuff. But then my follow-up question was, how do we get people to believe these forecasts are valid? And the answer there was basically, that's the $64,000 question, right? Didn't say that, but that's what it is: transparency, accuracy, and a track record, right? So I think I'm out of time. I think I'm going to be hauled off the stage here if I don't stop now. So you've been a great audience. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ira. This is an amazing conversation to hear from you. I think the museum really appreciates the work you've done, the fact that you got some of your raw materials from us here. There is an effort underway at the museum that is long running now. We're into the 2.5 years or so into it, about technology and the future of news. So we believe there are some fundamental conversations in this space, and we've done a national survey and things like that, which you can find on the website. It is fundamental, and I spent a lot of time, as I pointed out earlier, wanting to take the presidential debate videos and using modern AI techniques, using sentiment analysis, facial expressions, and also modeling the language of what they said versus what actually happened thereafter, and present that to the high school students who take civics classes and have them really appreciate what a debate might look like in a real world, in a modern communication forum. So there's a lot to be learned from history if we can present it in the right context. And I think it's really delightful to see the legwork that you've done to sort of surface the really ground zero of the use of the electronic brains. I found it fascinating that the machines were, of course, called he, when in fact all of the early computers were women and doing the math. And that is also another fascinating moment in time. So anyway, thank you so much for that. So again, thank you, Ira, for what you've done, and thanks for your evening. So welcome, and thanks, everyone. Great.